Long before the word America existed, before borders were drawn or flags planted, millions of people lived across this vast land in societies that were complex, organized, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature. The idea that this continent was discovered in 1492 is one of the most enduring myths in American history. It survives not because it is accurate, but because it is convenient. Howard Zinn opens his reinterpretation of American history by asking a simple but unsettling question: discovered by whom and at what cost? Indigenous societies across North America were not wandering tribes waiting for civilization. They were farmers, traders, builders, and political thinkers. The Arawaks of the Caribbean cultivated crops, fished, and lived in villages governed by shared responsibility. In the Northeast, confederacies like the Iroquois developed systems of governance so sophisticated that elements of them later influenced American political thought. Across the plains, deserts, forests, and coasts, societies adapted ingeniously to their environments, developing economies and cultures that endured for centuries. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he did not encounter emptiness. He encountered people. What followed was not an exchange between equals, but the beginning of one of the most devastating periods of conquest in human history. Zinn emphasizes that the violence of colonization was not accidental or isolated. It was systematic, driven by the demands of empire, gold, land, and labor. Columbus himself recorded the ease with which indigenous people could be dominated, enslaved, and exploited. Within decades, entire populations in the Caribbean were destroyed through forced labor, disease, and mass killing. The traditional American histories often frame this era as tragic but unavoidable, a clash of civilizations with unfortunate consequences. Zinn challenges that framing. He argues that the suffering was not a byproduct of progress but its foundation. Colonization required dehumanization. The language of savages and inferiors justified violence and theft on a massive scale. This pattern would repeat itself across the continent for centuries. As European powers established colonies, they brought with them rigid hierarchies. Land became property. Labor became a commodity. Those at the bottom, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and poor European settlers, paid the price. Zinn insists that American history cannot be understood by focusing solely on founding documents and great leaders, while ignoring those who bore the consequences of their decisions. The early colonies were not havens of freedom. They were experiments in control. Indigenous land was seized through treaties made under duress or ignored altogether. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in conditions so brutal that many did not survive the journey. White indentured servants, often fleeing poverty in Europe, found themselves trapped in systems of labor little better than slavery. Violence was not only external. Colonial elites feared rebellion from below. Zinn documents repeated uprisings by enslaved people, by poor farmers, by workers, each met with force or manipulation. One of the most effective tools of control was division. Race became a weapon. By granting limited privileges to poor white settlers, colonial leaders prevented unity between oppressed groups. This strategy laid the groundwork for racial hierarchies that would define American society long after independence. Even as colonies grew wealthier, inequality deepened. The promise of opportunity masked a reality in which a small elite accumulated land and power, while the majority struggled to survive. Zinn argues that this imbalance was not accidental. It was built into the system from the beginning. What makes Zinn's approach so unsettling is not simply his recounting of violence, but his insistence that resistance existed everywhere. Indigenous people fought back. Enslaved Africans resisted in subtle and overt ways. Poor settlers rebelled against landlords and governors. These stories are often omitted because they challenge the idea that American history moves smoothly toward freedom and democracy. By starting American history here, before independence, before constitutions and presidents, Zinn forces the listener to reconsider what the nation was built upon. Not unity but conflict, not consensus but struggle. The United States did not begin as a shared project. It began as a contested one. This perspective does not deny later achievements, but it reframes them. Progress, Zinn suggests, has always been pushed from below, not granted from above. Rights were not gifts from enlightened leaders. They were concessions wrested through resistance. Understanding this pattern is essential to understanding everything that follows in American history. As the colonies moved toward revolution, these tensions did not disappear. They intensified. And in the next part of this documentary, we will explore how the American Revolution, often celebrated as a unified fight for liberty, was also a carefully managed uprising, shaped by elites determined to preserve their power while channeling popular anger into safer forms. As the American colonies expanded through the 17th and 18th centuries, they did not grow into societies united by shared purpose. They grew into deeply unequal worlds defined by class tension, fear of rebellion, and constant negotiation between those who held power and those who labored beneath it. Long before independence was declared, the foundations of American conflict were already firmly in place. Howard Zinn argues that to understand the American Revolution, we must first understand the unrest that preceded it, not between colonies and Britain, but within colonial society itself. Colonial America was a place where land was abundant in theory but tightly controlled in practice. Large landowners, merchants, and colonial officials accumulated wealth through trade, speculation, and political connections, while small farmers struggled under debt, taxes, and unstable markets. Urban workers faced irregular employment, low wages, and rising prices. Enslaved Africans endured conditions of extreme violence, exploitation, and surveillance. Indigenous communities were pushed further from their lands as colonial expansion accelerated. These pressures created a volatile environment where rebellion was not rare, it was expected. Zinn documents a long list of uprisings that traditional histories often reduce to footnotes. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 was not simply a frontier dispute. It was a mass uprising of poor farmers, servants, and enslaved people against Virginia's ruling elite. The rebels burned Jamestown and briefly seized control of the colony. What frightened colonial leaders was not the violence itself, but the cooperation across racial and economic lines. The response was swift and instructive. After the rebellion collapsed, elites moved to harden racial divisions, expanding privileges for poor whites while intensifying control over enslaved Africans. Race became a deliberate tool to prevent class unity. This strategy proved devastatingly effective. Over time, white settlers were encouraged to identify upward rather than outward, to see their interests aligned with landowners rather than with enslaved or indigenous people. Zinn emphasizes that racism in America was not an inevitable product of cultural difference. It was cultivated, reinforced by law, violence, and economic incentive because it served those in power. By the mid-18th century, resistance continued to erupt. Tenant farmers protested rents, sailors mutinied against brutal ship conditions. Urban crowds rioted over food shortages and political exclusion. Enslaved people rebelled whenever opportunity allowed, sometimes through organized revolts, more often through escape, sabotage, or refusal to submit. Colonial authorities responded with force, but also with careful management of anger. Repression alone was risky. A smarter approach was diversion. This is where the conflict with Britain enters the story. Zinn argues that the American Revolution cannot be understood simply as a fight for liberty against tyranny. It was also a way for colonial elites to redirect widespread unrest away from themselves and toward an external enemy. By framing grievances as national rather than class-based, leaders could unite disparate groups without threatening existing hierarchies. Taxes imposed by Britain, such as the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, certainly angered colonists. But Zinn notes that these taxes were modest compared to the economic burdens already imposed by local elites. The rhetoric of no taxation without representation resonated not because people were suddenly politically awakened, but because it gave voice to deeper frustrations rooted in inequality and exclusion. The colonial leaders seized this opportunity to channel popular anger into a controlled movement for independence. This does not mean the revolution was a fraud. It means it was complex. Ordinary people participated because they hoped independence would bring real change, more land, fairer laws, greater equality. Elites participated because independence offered freedom from British constraints while preserving their own authority. These goals overlapped just enough to sustain a mass movement, but they were never identical. Zinn highlights how revolutionary rhetoric promised liberty while carefully avoiding challenges to property and class structure. Calls for equality were powerful but vague. Freedom was celebrated but rarely defined. When independence was achieved, these ambiguities became decisive. The question was no longer how to defeat Britain, but how to govern a deeply divided society without provoking another uprising from below. The Declaration of Independence spoke of equality and natural rights, yet it was written by men who owned land, slaves, or both. Zinn does not dismiss the document's ideals, but he insists we examine the gap between words and reality. Slavery remained intact. Women were excluded, property qualifications restricted voting. Indigenous land seizures continued unabated. Independence changed who ruled, not who was ruled still. Resistance did not disappear. During and after the revolution, soldiers mutinied over unpaid wages. Farmers rebelled against debt and foreclosure, most famously in Shays' Rebellion. These movements terrified the new American elite, convincing them that independence alone was not enough. Order had to be secured. This fear directly shaped the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Zinn argues that the Constitution was not designed primarily to expand democracy, but to contain it. By centralizing power, limiting direct participation, and protecting property, the new government aimed to stabilize society while preventing popular uprisings. It was a document of compromise between states, between interests, and most importantly, between elite control and mass pressure. The American Revolution, then, was neither a simple triumph of freedom nor a mere elite conspiracy. It was a negotiated transformation, driven by pressure from below and managed from above. Its legacy was not equality but possibility. The struggle did not end with independence, it only changed form. In the next part of this documentary, we will examine how the new United States dealt with the contradictions it inherited: slavery in a nation founded on liberty, expansion in a land already occupied, and democracy constrained by wealth, race, and gender, and how these tensions shaped the early republic. With independence secured and a new government in place, the United States entered a period often described as the birth of democracy. But beneath the celebration and symbolism, the young nation was already grappling with contradictions that would shape its future. The ideals of liberty and equality were now enshrined in founding documents. Yet the social and economic realities of the new republic told a far more uneven story. Howard Zinn emphasizes that the early United States was less a radical break from the past than a reorganization of power, one that preserved existing hierarchies while presenting them in revolutionary language. The Constitution, hailed as a triumph of political wisdom, was also a response to fear. The ruling class of the new nation had watched rebellions erupt during and after the Revolution, soldiers demanding pay, farmers resisting debt, poor citizens challenging elite authority. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts was especially alarming. Armed farmers shut down courts to prevent foreclosures, exposing how fragile social order remained. To men of property, this was not democracy in action, but chaos threatening wealth and stability. The Constitution, Zinn argues, was designed to restrain such popular movements while maintaining the appearance of government by the people. Power was deliberately filtered. Senators were originally appointed, not elected. The president was chosen indirectly. Voting rights were limited by property ownership. The system encouraged participation, but only within carefully defined boundaries. This did not eliminate dissent, it managed it. The new government was strong enough to suppress rebellion, but flexible enough to absorb criticism without collapsing. Nowhere were these contradictions clearer than in the issue of slavery. The revolution's rhetoric had inspired enslaved people to resist, escape, and demand freedom. Thousands joined the British during the war, hoping promises of emancipation would be honored. Others fought alongside revolutionaries, believing liberty would finally include them. Yet when independence was achieved, slavery remained intact. Compromises in the Constitution protected the institution through clauses on representation and fugitive slaves. Zinn argues that these decisions were not moral oversights but calculated political choices, made to preserve unity among states and protect economic interests. For enslaved Africans, freedom remained distant. The cotton gin, invented in the 1790s, transformed slavery from a declining system into a booming economic engine. As cotton production expanded westward, so did the demand for enslaved labor. Families were torn apart. Violence intensified. The nation that declared all men created equal became increasingly dependent on human bondage. At the same time, the United States embarked on aggressive territorial expansion. Land was the currency of opportunity, but it was land already occupied by indigenous nations. Treaties were signed, broken, and rewritten as settlers pushed west. Zinn emphasizes that this expansion was not inevitable or peaceful. It was enforced through military campaigns, forced removals, and deliberate policy. The idea of progress masked a relentless process of dispossession. Indigenous resistance was persistent and widespread. Leaders like Tecumseh attempted to unite tribes against American encroachment, recognizing that survival depended on collective action. These efforts were crushed by military force, and the federal government continued to prioritize expansion over coexistence. The early republic treated indigenous sovereignty as an obstacle rather than a principle. Economic inequality also deepened during this period. While political leaders spoke of opportunity and independence, wealth concentrated rapidly in the hands of merchants, land speculators, and financiers. Workers labored long hours for low wages. Debtors filled prisons. Zinn points out that early American capitalism produced both growth and hardship, creating tensions that erupted in strikes, protests, and riots. These conflicts are often omitted from traditional narratives, yet they reveal how contested the nation's development truly was. Despite these realities, resistance continued. Enslaved people escaped along informal networks that would later be known as the Underground Railroad. Workers organized early unions and staged strikes. Women challenged legal and social restrictions, demanding greater autonomy. These movements were rarely unified or victorious, but they kept pressure on the system, forcing incremental change. Zinn's central argument becomes increasingly clear here. Progress in American history has never been linear or inevitable. It has emerged through conflict, often in opposition to those in power. The early republic did not resolve the tensions between freedom and inequality. It institutionalized them. As the nation moved into the 19th century, these unresolved contradictions intensified. Slavery expanded even as abolitionist movements grew stronger. Industrialization created unprecedented wealth alongside grinding poverty. Expansion promised opportunity while spreading violence and displacement. The United States was growing rapidly, but it was growing unevenly. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the nation into the age of expansion, reform, and mounting sectional conflict, examining how debates over slavery, labor, and democracy pushed the country toward its greatest internal crisis, the Civil War, and how ordinary people, not just famous leaders, shaped that struggle. As the United States pushed deeper into the 19th century, the tensions embedded at its founding began to surface with increasing intensity. The nation expanded geographically at a breathtaking pace, fueled by land hunger, economic ambition, and a belief in destiny that framed conquest as progress. Yet beneath the language of opportunity and growth lay conflicts that could no longer be managed through compromise alone. Slavery, labor exploitation, indigenous displacement, and class inequality converged, creating pressures that would ultimately tear the country apart. Territorial expansion became the defining force of this era. New lands promised wealth to settlers, profits to speculators, and political power to those who controlled them. But these lands were not empty. Indigenous nations stood in the way of expansion, and the federal government increasingly treated their presence as a problem to be solved rather than a people to be respected. Policies of removal, justified as necessary for peace and progress, resulted in mass displacement and death. The Trail of Tears was not an accident of history, but a deliberate outcome of expansionist policy, enforced by law and military power. At the same time, the expansion of territory reignited the unresolved question of slavery. Each new state forced the nation to confront whether human bondage would spread or be contained. Compromises were crafted to delay confrontation, but they did not address the moral and economic realities at the heart of the issue. Slavery was not simply a regional tradition, it was a central pillar of the national economy. Northern industries depended on Southern cotton. Financial institutions profited from enslaved labor. Zinn stresses that the entire nation was implicated, even as political leaders attempted to frame slavery as a sectional problem. Resistance to slavery grew louder during this period, but it was far from unified. Abolitionists faced hostility, censorship, and violence. Enslaved people themselves remained the most consistent force of resistance through escape, rebellion, and refusal. Figures like Frederick Douglass emerged not only as voices against slavery, but as critics of a nation that proclaimed liberty while enforcing bondage. Zinn highlights how these voices were often marginalized in mainstream narratives that focused instead on political compromise and gradualism. Industrialization transformed northern cities just as dramatically as cotton transformed the South. Factories drew workers into urban centers where long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions became the norm. Women and children labored alongside men, often for a fraction of the pay. Wealth accumulated rapidly at the top, while poverty deepened at the bottom. Strikes and labor protests erupted repeatedly, challenging the idea that American capitalism was naturally just or self-correcting. The government's response to labor unrest mirrored its response to other forms of resistance. While political rhetoric celebrated freedom and opportunity, state power was often deployed to suppress challenges from below. Militias broke strikes, courts sided with employers. Laws were written to protect property over people. Zinn argues that this pattern reveals a consistent priority in American governance: stability over justice, order over equality. As sectional conflict intensified, political leaders struggled to maintain unity. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act each attempted to preserve balance between free and slave states. But each compromise also deepened resentment. Violence in Bleeding Kansas made it clear that the issue of slavery could no longer be contained through legislation alone. Ordinary settlers, not just politicians, were now fighting over the future of the nation. Zinn challenges the traditional narrative that portrays the Civil War as an inevitable moral crusade led by heroic leaders. He argues that the war emerged from decades of unresolved conflict driven by economic interests, political power, and resistance from below. For many ordinary Americans, the war was not initially about ending slavery. It was about preserving the Union, defending livelihoods, or surviving in a rapidly changing world. Enslaved people, however, understood the stakes clearly. As the war unfolded, they forced the issue of emancipation through mass escape, labor withdrawal, and pressure on Union forces. Zinn emphasizes that emancipation was not simply granted from above. It was demanded from below. Enslaved people turned the war into a struggle over freedom by making slavery impossible to ignore. The Emancipation Proclamation, often celebrated as a moral turning point, was also a strategic decision shaped by military necessity and political calculation. It freed enslaved people only in Confederate-held territories and left slavery intact in loyal border states. Even so, it transformed the character of the war and opened the door for black soldiers to fight for their own liberation. By the war's end, slavery had been abolished, but the deeper structures of inequality remained. The 13th Amendment ended legal bondage, yet land, wealth, and political power stayed firmly in the hands of a small elite. Reconstruction briefly offered the possibility of a more democratic society, as formerly enslaved people participated in politics and demanded civil rights. But this period was short-lived and fiercely contested. White resistance to Reconstruction was violent and organized. Paramilitary groups terrorized black communities. Federal commitment waned. Compromises once again prioritized national unity over justice. Zinn argues that Reconstruction did not fail because it went too far, but because it did not go far enough. Without economic redistribution and sustained protection, political rights proved fragile. As the 19th century drew to a close, the United States emerged reunited but deeply unequal. Slavery was gone, but racial hierarchy endured. Expansion continued, but at enormous human cost. Industrial wealth soared, while labor exploitation intensified. The nation had survived its greatest internal crisis, but it had not resolved the contradictions that caused it. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the United States into the age of industrial capitalism, corporate power, and imperial expansion, examining how the struggles of workers, immigrants, and marginalized communities shaped a new phase of American history. As the United States moved out of the Civil War and into the late 19th century, the promise of freedom and equality gave way to a new reality shaped by industrial capitalism, corporate power, and widening inequality. The nation entered what would later be called the Gilded Age, a period marked by spectacular wealth for a small elite and relentless hardship for millions of workers. Howard Zinn argues that this era was not an accidental deviation from American ideals, but a logical continuation of patterns established long before: concentrated power at the top, resistance from below, and a government that repeatedly sided with property over people. Railroads stretched across the continent, linking markets and accelerating industrial growth. Steel mills, coal mines, textile factories, and slaughterhouses transformed the economy at unprecedented speed. Cities swelled with immigrants arriving from Europe, drawn by the promise of work and escape from poverty, only to find themselves trapped in overcrowded housing, dangerous jobs, and constant insecurity. 12-hour workdays were common, injuries were routine, death was an accepted cost of doing business. Industrialists were celebrated as captains of industry, self-made men whose success symbolized American opportunity. Zinn challenges this narrative by emphasizing the conditions that made such fortunes possible. Wealth was built not only through innovation, but through exploitation. Wages were kept low through strike-breaking, blacklists, and violence. Child labor flourished. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent. The prosperity of the few rested on the exhaustion of the many. Resistance emerged almost immediately. Workers organized unions, staged strikes, and demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. These movements were not fringe disruptions. They were widespread and often massive. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 shut down rail traffic across multiple states and was met with federal troops. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago, sparked by demands for an 8-hour workday, ended in bloodshed and the execution of labor activists. Zinn stresses that these confrontations reveal a stark truth about American democracy during this period. When economic power was challenged, state power was deployed to defend it. Immigrants bore the brunt of this repression. They were portrayed as dangerous, un-American, and responsible for social unrest, a narrative that justified discrimination and division. Yet immigrant workers were among the most active organizers, forming unions and mutual aid societies to survive hostile conditions. Zinn highlights how elites exploited ethnic and racial divisions to prevent solidarity, echoing strategies used in the colonial era. Workers were encouraged to see each other as competitors rather than allies. For African Americans in the South, the end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of a new system of control. Sharecropping replaced slavery in form but not in function, trapping families in cycles of debt and dependency. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and stripped black citizens of political power through literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation. Lynching became a tool of terror, used to reinforce racial hierarchy and suppress resistance. Zinn argues that this system was not a betrayal of American democracy, but one of its outcomes, tolerated and often supported by federal indifference. Women, too, faced limited opportunities despite their central role in the industrial workforce. They labored in factories, worked as domestic servants, and organized for better conditions, yet remained excluded from political power. The suffrage movement gained momentum during this era, but progress was slow and uneven. Zinn emphasizes that women's rights, like labor rights, advanced not through goodwill from above but through sustained pressure from below. As inequality deepened, criticism of corporate power spread beyond labor movements. Writers and reformers exposed corruption, monopolies, and political bribery. Populist movements emerged among farmers crushed by debt and falling prices, demanding regulation of railroads, currency reform, and greater democratic control. These movements represented a direct challenge to the economic order, and for a moment they threatened to reshape American politics. The response was familiar. Some reforms were adopted to diffuse unrest, but the underlying structure remained intact. Courts consistently ruled in favor of corporations, interpreting the Constitution as a shield for property rather than a tool for social justice. The language of freedom was preserved, even as its meaning narrowed. At the same time, the United States turned outward. Having consolidated control over the continent through violence and displacement, the nation began to look overseas. Zinn argues that American imperialism was not a sudden departure from national values, but an extension of internal expansion. The same logic that justified seizing indigenous land and exploiting labor at home now justified intervention abroad. The Spanish-American War marked a turning point. Framed as a humanitarian mission to liberate Cuba, the war resulted in the United States taking control of territories including Puerto Rico and the Philippines. In the Philippines, American forces waged a brutal campaign against independence fighters, employing tactics that mirrored those used against indigenous peoples on the frontier. Zinn highlights how the rhetoric of freedom masked the reality of domination. Domestically, imperial expansion helped deflect attention from inequality at home. Foreign victories fueled national pride and distracted from labor unrest and racial violence. This pattern, Zinn suggests, would repeat itself throughout American history. External conflict used to manage internal tension. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had emerged as an industrial and imperial power, but the costs were unmistakable. Wealth was concentrated, workers were exploited, racial hierarchies were entrenched, democratic participation was constrained, yet resistance had not disappeared, it had evolved. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the United States into the Progressive Era and the early 20th century, examining how reform movements challenged corporate power, how war reshaped the nation's priorities, and how ordinary people continued to push for change in a system designed to limit it. As the 20th century began, the United States stood at a crossroads. Industrial power had made the nation wealthy, but that wealth was dangerously concentrated. Cities groaned under overcrowding and pollution. Workers labored long hours with little protection. Farmers were crushed by debt. Corruption flowed easily between corporate boardrooms and political offices. The country projected confidence abroad, but at home, social pressure was building toward rupture. Out of this tension emerged a wave of reform known as the Progressive Era, often remembered as a moment when the system corrected itself. Howard Zinn urges a more careful reading. Reform, he argues, did not replace the foundations of inequality. It stabilized them. Progressive reformers exposed abuses, passed regulations, and promoted efficiency in government. Child labor laws, food safety regulations, and antitrust measures addressed some of the most visible injustices of industrial capitalism. Yet these reforms were carefully limited. They aimed to make capitalism safer and more sustainable, not to redistribute power. Workers gained protections, but corporations retained control. Elections became cleaner, but economic inequality persisted. Progressivism improved conditions without challenging the structure that created them. At the same time, resistance from below intensified. Labor movements grew larger and more militant. Organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World rejected gradual reform altogether, calling instead for radical transformation of the economic system. Strikes erupted across industries, often met with police violence, private militias, and federal intervention. Zinn emphasizes that while reformers and radicals are often grouped together in historical memory, they were frequently in conflict. Reform sought compromise, radicalism sought change. Women played a central role in this era, organizing for suffrage, labor rights, and social reform. The fight for the vote was not simply about political participation. It was about recognition and power. When women finally secured the right to vote in 1920, it marked a major victory, but one achieved after decades of pressure and sacrifice. Even then, many women, especially women of color, remained excluded in practice through discriminatory laws and violence. As domestic tensions mounted, the United States once again turned its attention outward. World War I presented itself as a moral crusade, framed as a fight to make the world safe for democracy. Zinn challenges this framing, arguing that American involvement was shaped as much by economic and strategic interests as by idealism. U.S. corporations profited enormously from war production. Banks extended massive loans. The machinery of war created opportunity for expansion, even as it demanded sacrifice from ordinary people. At home, dissent was treated as a threat. The government launched an aggressive campaign to suppress opposition, using laws like the Espionage and Sedition Acts to silence critics. Socialists, labor organizers, pacifists, and immigrants were arrested, deported, or imprisoned for speaking out. Zinn highlights this moment as a stark example of how quickly democratic principles can be suspended when power feels challenged. Free speech existed, but only within acceptable boundaries. The war ended, but repression did not. The post-war Red Scare targeted radicals and immigrants, reinforcing fear of dissent and strengthening the association between patriotism and obedience. At the same time, economic instability returned. The 1920s are often remembered as a decade of prosperity and cultural change, but this prosperity was uneven and fragile. Beneath the surface of consumer abundance lay deep structural weaknesses. Wealth concentrated further at the top. Speculation replaced production as a driver of growth. Workers' wages stagnated even as productivity increased. Farmers suffered from overproduction and falling prices. Credit expanded, masking insecurity with temporary comfort. Zinn argues that the economic collapse of 1929 was not a sudden accident, but the predictable result of unchecked inequality and instability. When the Great Depression hit, it exposed the limits of the American system. Millions lost jobs, homes, and savings almost overnight. Breadlines formed, banks failed, despair spread quickly. The myth of self-correcting capitalism collapsed under the weight of reality. Yet even in this moment of crisis, the response was shaped by fear of deeper change. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal is often celebrated as a turning point, a moment when government finally acted to protect ordinary people. Zinn offers a more nuanced view. The New Deal provided relief, created jobs, and regulated parts of the economy, but it did not fundamentally alter the distribution of wealth or power. Its purpose, he argues, was not to end capitalism but to save it from collapse. Still, the New Deal did not emerge from generosity alone. It was driven by pressure. Workers organized massive strikes. Veterans marched on Washington. Farmers resisted evictions. Communists and socialists gained influence in labor movements. Faced with the possibility of unrest, the government acted. Reform became a tool of stabilization, a way to absorb dissent without surrendering control. For many Americans, the New Deal brought real improvements. Unions gained legal recognition. Social Security offered a safety net. Public works projects provided dignity through labor. Yet exclusions remained. Agricultural and domestic workers, many of them black, were left out of key protections. Racial segregation persisted. Inequality narrowed slightly, but the hierarchy endured. As the nation began to recover, another global conflict loomed. Once again, war would reshape American society, economy, and identity. Once again, it would be framed as a fight for freedom. And once again, it would test the boundaries of democracy at home. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the United States through World War II and into the post-war era, examining how war transformed the nation, expanded its global power, and set the stage for new struggles over race, class, and ideology that would define the second half of the 20th century. World War II transformed the United States more profoundly than any conflict before it, not only by reshaping its global position, but by reorganizing life at home in ways that would echo for decades. The war ended the Great Depression almost overnight. Factories roared back to life, unemployment vanished, and industrial production surged to levels previously unimaginable. For many Americans, the war felt like redemption, proof that the nation had finally overcome its economic paralysis. Yet Howard Zinn urges us to look past the surface of unity and prosperity to see the uneven realities beneath it. The war effort demanded sacrifice, but not equally. Millions of men were drafted and sent overseas, while women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, filling roles long denied to them. Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol, representing strength, patriotism, and possibility. Yet this empowerment was conditional. Women were encouraged to work for the duration of the war, not to claim permanent equality. When peace returned, many were pushed back into domestic roles, their wartime contributions quietly minimized. For African Americans, the war created opportunity and contradiction at the same time. Defense industries offered jobs previously closed to black workers, and migration from the rural South to northern cities accelerated. Yet segregation remained deeply entrenched. Black soldiers served in segregated units, often assigned menial tasks, fighting for freedoms abroad that they were denied at home. Zinn highlights how civil rights leaders recognized this hypocrisy and used the language of wartime democracy to press for change. The Double V campaign called for victory against fascism overseas and racism at home, exposing the gap between American ideals and American reality. Perhaps the starkest example of wartime contradiction was the internment of Japanese Americans. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, fear and racism combined to produce one of the most blatant violations of civil liberties in U.S. history. Over 110,000 people, most of them American citizens, were forced into camps without evidence of disloyalty. The Supreme Court upheld the policy. Zinn points out that this episode reveals how quickly constitutional protections can be suspended when fear dominates public life, even in a nation fighting a war in the name of freedom. On the global stage, World War II positioned the United States as a dominant power. Europe and Asia lay devastated, while American industry emerged stronger than ever. The war ended with the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, actions justified as necessary to end the conflict quickly. Zinn challenges this justification, arguing that alternatives existed and that the bombings served not only to defeat Japan, but to demonstrate power in a new geopolitical order. Whether or not one accepts this interpretation, the bomb introduced a reality that would shape the rest of the century. Humanity now possessed the ability to annihilate itself. The post-war years brought prosperity for many Americans, particularly white middle-class families. Government programs helped veterans buy homes, attend college, and start businesses. Suburbs expanded rapidly, symbolizing stability and success. Yet access to these benefits was not equal. Discriminatory housing policies, lending practices, and segregation excluded many black families from the post-war boom. Wealth accumulated across generations for some, while others were systematically left behind. At the same time, the United States entered the Cold War, a prolonged struggle with the Soviet Union framed as a battle between freedom and tyranny. Zinn argues that this framing simplified a complex reality and served domestic purposes as much as foreign ones. Fear of communism justified massive military spending, overseas intervention, and suppression of dissent at home. Loyalty oaths, blacklists, and congressional investigations targeted artists, intellectuals, and activists, creating a climate of suspicion and conformity. The Cold War reshaped American priorities. Resources flowed into weapons development, foreign bases, and proxy wars, while social needs competed for attention. The narrative of national security often overrode concerns about democracy, both abroad and at home. Zinn emphasizes that anti-communism became a powerful tool for marginalizing movements that challenged economic inequality or racial injustice, labeling them un-American regardless of their goals. Yet resistance did not disappear. Beneath the surface of conformity, new movements began to form. African American veterans returned from the war determined to claim the rights they had defended. Early civil rights campaigns challenged segregation through legal action, protest, and grassroots organizing. Workers continued to demand fair wages and conditions, even as unions faced pressure to align with Cold War politics. Internationally, former colonies watched the war's rhetoric of freedom closely. Independence movements spread across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, challenging European empires and complicating American foreign policy. The United States often found itself supporting anti-colonial language while opposing movements that threatened its strategic interests. Zinn argues that this contradiction revealed a pattern. American policy prioritized stability and influence over self-determination. By the early 1950s, the United States appeared confident, powerful, and prosperous, yet deeply divided beneath the surface. The economy thrived, but inequality persisted. Democracy was celebrated, but dissent was constrained. Freedom was defended abroad, but contested at home. The conditions were set for a new wave of social struggle that would challenge not only specific injustices, but the very narratives the nation told about itself. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the rise of the civil rights movement, the expansion of protest culture, and the growing resistance to American intervention overseas, examining how ordinary people once again pushed the nation to confront the gap between its ideals and its actions. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the contradictions of post-war America could no longer be contained by prosperity or patriotic language. Beneath the image of national unity lay deep fractures that demanded confrontation. For African Americans, the promise of citizenship remained hollow in much of the country, especially in the South, where segregation governed nearly every aspect of daily life. Schools, transportation, housing, employment, and voting were regulated by law and violence, reinforcing a racial order that had survived emancipation, Reconstruction, and decades of supposed progress. Howard Zinn emphasizes that the civil rights movement did not emerge suddenly or spontaneously. It was the product of long resistance, patient organizing, and the refusal of ordinary people to accept a system built to exclude them. Legal challenges had chipped away at segregation for years, but change accelerated when mass action entered the picture. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated the power of collective economic pressure, showing that nonviolent resistance could disrupt everyday systems of control. Sit-ins spread across the South as students refused to leave segregated lunch counters, facing arrest, harassment, and physical violence with disciplined resolve. These actions exposed segregation not as a regional quirk, but as a moral crisis visible to the entire nation. Zinn highlights how young people, often dismissed as naive or reckless, became the backbone of a movement that forced the federal government to respond. The movement's success lay not only in its moral appeal, but in its ability to create disruption. Marches, boycotts, and voter registration drives made injustice impossible to ignore. Television, images of peaceful protesters attacked by police dogs and fire hoses shattered the narrative of gradual progress. Federal intervention, when it came, was rarely proactive. It was reactive, driven by fear of instability and international embarrassment as much as by commitment to justice. Legislation followed. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act marked genuine achievements, dismantling the legal framework of segregation and expanding political access. Yet Zinn cautions against viewing these victories as endpoints. Laws changed faster than economic realities. Voting rights did not automatically produce jobs, housing, or safety. Many African Americans remained trapped in segregated neighborhoods, facing unemployment, underfunded schools, and aggressive policing. The movement's goals expanded as activists confronted the limits of legal reform. This shift became more visible as the 1960s progressed. Urban uprisings erupted in cities across the country, driven by frustration over persistent inequality and police violence. These rebellions were often framed as senseless riots, but Zinn urges a different interpretation. They were political acts born of desperation, responses to conditions that reform had failed to address. The question was no longer simply whether African Americans could vote or sit at lunch counters, but whether they could live with dignity. At the same time, the United States was becoming increasingly entangled in Vietnam. The war was presented as a necessary stand against communism, part of a global struggle for freedom. Zinn challenges this narrative, arguing that the war was rooted in colonial legacy, geopolitical strategy, and fear of losing influence rather than defense of democracy. American involvement escalated steadily, drawing millions of young men into a conflict fought thousands of miles from home. As casualties mounted and victory remained elusive, opposition grew. Students organized teach-ins, questioning official explanations and exposing contradictions between democratic ideals and military reality. Veterans returned disillusioned, speaking openly about what they had witnessed. Draft resistance spread, challenging the assumption that obedience was patriotic. Zinn emphasizes that the anti-war movement was not a fringe phenomenon. It became one of the largest mass protests in American history, forcing a reckoning with the cost of American power. The civil rights movement and the anti-war movement intersected in powerful ways. Activists recognized that racism, poverty, and militarism were interconnected. Martin Luther King Jr.'s decision to speak out against the Vietnam War reflected this understanding, linking domestic injustice with foreign violence. His stance cost him political support, revealing how tightly dissent was policed even within movements for change. Women, too, began to challenge the limits of post-war expectations. Inspired by civil rights activism and frustrated by domestic confinement, women organized for equality in work, education, and personal autonomy. The women's liberation movement questioned not only legal discrimination, but cultural assumptions about gender roles. Zinn highlights how these challenges were often dismissed as disruptive or extreme, even as they addressed systemic inequality. Government response followed a familiar pattern. Some reforms were enacted, but repression increased alongside them. The surveillance of activists expanded. Law enforcement infiltrated organizations. Protest was tolerated up to a point, then met with force. The assassinations of key figures and violent clashes between protesters and police signaled a nation under strain. By the end of the 1960s, the United States had changed irrevocably. Segregation was no longer legal. The war in Vietnam was widely questioned. New movements had reshaped public discourse around race, gender, and power. Yet Zinn argues that the underlying structures of inequality remained largely intact. Economic power stayed concentrated. Military influence persisted. Political participation expanded, but policy outcomes often favored established interests. The period revealed both the possibility and the limits of reform. Mass movements could force change, but sustaining that change required more than legislation. It required ongoing pressure, organization, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about American society. As the nation moved into the 1970s, exhaustion set in. The optimism of the early civil rights movement gave way to fragmentation. The anti-war movement lost focus as the war wound down. Economic instability returned, reshaping priorities and alliances. The question was no longer how to achieve change, but how to preserve it. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow the United States through the late 20th century, examining how backlash, economic transformation, and renewed global ambition reshaped the nation after the upheavals of the 1960s, and how the struggles of that decade continued to influence American life in less visible but enduring ways. As the upheavals of the 1960s faded into the background, the United States entered a period often described as a return to normalcy. The Vietnam War wound down, protest movements fragmented, and political leaders promised stability after years of turmoil. Yet beneath this appearance of calm, the country was undergoing profound structural change. Howard Zinn argues that the decades following the 1960s were not a retreat from conflict, but a reorganization of power that absorbed the energy of resistance while preserving inequality in new forms. The end of the Vietnam War did not bring the national reckoning many activists had hoped for. While the war was widely acknowledged as a mistake, responsibility was rarely assigned in ways that challenged the broader framework of American foreign policy. Military spending remained high. Intervention continued, though often through proxies, covert operations, and economic pressure rather than large-scale troop deployments. The lesson absorbed by political leaders was not to avoid war, but to manage public perception more carefully. Domestically, the economic foundations of American life were shifting. Manufacturing jobs that had sustained working-class communities for generations began to disappear, moved overseas, or replaced by automation. What followed was not a sudden collapse but a slow erosion. Wages stagnated. Job security declined. Unions weakened under legal and political pressure. Zinn emphasizes that this transformation was often framed as inevitable, the natural outcome of global competition, rather than a series of policy choices that favored corporate mobility over worker stability. At the same time, wealth increasingly concentrated at the top. Tax policies favored the affluent. Financial markets expanded their influence over everyday life. Debt became a normal condition, used to bridge the gap between stagnant incomes and rising costs of housing, education, and healthcare. The promise of upward mobility persisted in rhetoric, even as statistical reality made it less attainable for many. Inequality widened quietly, without the dramatic confrontations that had characterized earlier eras. Politics reflected this shift. The language of reform gave way to the language of efficiency and personal responsibility. Social programs were criticized as wasteful or enabling dependency. Zinn argues that this framing obscured structural causes of poverty and redirected blame onto individuals. Problems once understood as collective were redefined as personal failures, weakening the sense of shared obligation that had fueled earlier movements. Race remained a central fault line. Legal segregation was gone, but economic and residential segregation persisted, reinforced by policy decisions and market forces. Urban neighborhoods faced disinvestment, aggressive policing, and mass incarceration. The criminal justice system expanded rapidly, particularly affecting Black and Latino communities. Zinn interprets this expansion not simply as a response to crime, but as a new mechanism of social control in an era when overt racial exclusion was no longer acceptable. The war on drugs exemplified this pattern. Framed as a fight for public safety, it resulted in harsh sentencing laws, swollen prison populations, and long-term consequences for entire communities. Zinn notes that these policies coincided with reductions in social spending, suggesting a shift in priorities from support to punishment. Order was maintained not through inclusion, but through containment. Foreign policy during this period followed a similar logic. The Cold War continued to justify intervention, even as its moral clarity faded. The United States supported authoritarian regimes abroad as long as they aligned with strategic interests. Conflicts in Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia were framed as necessary defenses against instability, while their human costs remained distant from everyday American life. Zinn argues that this distance was crucial. War became something experienced by others, allowing it to persist with less domestic opposition. Yet resistance did not vanish. It adapted. Environmental movements gained strength as pollution, resource extraction, and climate threats became harder to ignore. Indigenous activism challenged long-standing injustices, reclaiming land and asserting sovereignty. LGBTQ movements pushed visibility and legal recognition into the public sphere. Each of these struggles expanded the definition of rights and justice, even as they encountered backlash. Media played a growing role in shaping public consciousness. Television and later digital platforms transformed how events were experienced, often prioritizing spectacle over context. Zinn cautions that information abundance does not guarantee understanding. Narratives are shaped by who controls platforms, resources, and framing. The stories a society tells about itself remain as important as the facts it contains. By the end of the 20th century, the United States stood as the world's dominant power, yet deeply uncertain about its direction. The Cold War ended not with a decisive victory for democracy everywhere, but with unresolved questions about global responsibility and domestic inequality. Economic growth returned, but its benefits were uneven. Political participation continued, but trust in institutions declined. Zinn's interpretation of this period resists triumphalism. He does not deny achievements or dismiss progress, but he insists on measuring success by its distribution. Who benefited, who paid the cost, whose voices shaped policy, and whose were ignored? These questions, he argues, remain essential for understanding American history beyond surface narratives. The late 20th century closed with a sense of contradiction. The nation celebrated freedom, innovation, and prosperity, yet struggled with alienation, inequality, and a lingering sense of unfinished business. The movements of the past had reshaped the cultural landscape, but power structures adapted rather than dissolved. Change had occurred, but within limits. As the United States moved into a new century, these unresolved tensions did not disappear. They intensified under new conditions, shaped by technology, global interdependence, and renewed conflict. In the next part of this documentary, we will examine how the events of the early 21st century, terrorism, war, economic crisis, and social media, reshaped American life and revived many of the questions that have echoed throughout the nation's history. As the United States entered the 21st century, it did so carrying unresolved tensions from every era that came before. Economic inequality had widened quietly over decades. Military power had expanded globally with limited public scrutiny. Political participation existed alongside deepening mistrust. Technology promised connection while accelerating fragmentation. Into this already unstable landscape came a single event that would reshape American life almost overnight. The attacks of September 11, 2001, produced shock, grief, and fear on a scale few Americans had ever experienced. For a moment, national unity felt absolute. Flags appeared everywhere. Political differences seemed to vanish. But Howard Zinn cautioned that moments of unity forged through trauma often conceal critical choices that determine the future far more than the event itself. The question was not how the nation mourned, but how it would respond. The response came swiftly and decisively. The language of a war on terror framed the world as a battlefield with no clear borders, timelines, or definitions of victory. Military action in Afghanistan was widely supported, seen as a direct response to the attacks. But this initial intervention soon expanded into a broader strategy that reshaped foreign policy, civil liberties, and the balance of power within the United States. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 marked a turning point. Justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction and framed as a mission to spread democracy, the war quickly revealed its contradictions. No such weapons were found. Civilian casualties mounted. Infrastructure collapsed. Zinn argued that this conflict followed a familiar pattern in American history, where fear and moral language were used to mobilize public support for actions rooted in strategic and economic interests rather than clear necessity. At home, the war transformed everyday life in quieter but lasting ways. The Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers, reducing privacy protections in the name of security. Detention without trial, extraordinary rendition, and enhanced interrogation techniques became part of official policy. Zinn emphasized that these measures were not temporary deviations, but structural shifts that normalized expanded state power. Once granted, such powers were rarely surrendered. Dissent, though present, struggled to gain traction. Large protests against the Iraq War took place before the invasion, yet they failed to alter policy. This disconnect highlighted a growing gap between public opinion and political action. Zinn argued that while formal democratic mechanisms remained intact, their influence over major decisions had weakened, especially in matters of war and corporate interest. Economically, the early 2000s continued trends established decades earlier. Financial markets grew increasingly complex and detached from everyday production. Housing prices soared, driven by speculation and easy credit. For many Americans, prosperity was sustained not through rising wages but through debt. The illusion of stability masked deep vulnerability. That vulnerability was exposed dramatically in 2008. The financial crisis shattered confidence in the economic system almost overnight. Banks collapsed, markets froze, millions lost jobs and homes, Retirement savings evaporated. The crisis revealed how thoroughly risk had been shifted downward, while reward remained concentrated at the top. When the system failed, it was rescued with public funds, while ordinary people absorbed the losses. Zinn's perspective framed the crisis not as an accident, but as the predictable outcome of deregulation, corporate influence, and political complicity. Financial institutions were deemed too big to fail, while individuals were left to navigate foreclosure, unemployment, and insecurity largely on their own. Once again, government intervention prioritized stability over justice. In response, new movements emerged. Occupy Wall Street crystallized public anger around inequality, introducing language that reshaped political discourse. The idea of the 1% entered mainstream conversation, giving shape to frustrations long felt but rarely articulated. Though Occupy lacked formal leadership and clear policy demands, Zinn would have recognized its significance as part of a historical pattern. Moments when ordinary people force uncomfortable truths into public view. Technology played a dual role in this era. Social media amplified voices, spread information rapidly, and facilitated organizing. At the same time, it fragmented attention, intensified polarization, and made sustained collective action harder to maintain. Zinn warned against confusing visibility with power. Awareness did not automatically translate into structural change. Meanwhile, long-standing issues of race and justice resurfaced with renewed urgency. High-profile cases of police violence sparked protests across the country, echoing earlier civil rights struggles while introducing new forms of activism. Movements demanded accountability, systemic reform, and recognition of historical injustice. Once again, resistance met backlash. Reform was promised, debated, delayed, and partially implemented, revealing the familiar cycle of pressure and containment. Foreign policy continued to operate within frameworks established during the Cold War and reinforced after 9/11. Military presence abroad remained extensive. Drone warfare expanded, reducing American casualties while raising ethical and legal questions about accountability. War became increasingly remote for most citizens, further distancing democratic oversight from military action. By the second decade of the 21st century, American society felt simultaneously connected and divided, prosperous and insecure, powerful and uncertain. Elections became more contentious. Trust in institutions declined. Political language hardened. Zinn's approach urges us to see these developments not as sudden breakdowns, but as the visible surface of long-term structural tensions. Throughout American history, moments of crisis have revealed underlying realities rather than creating them. The early 21st century was no exception. The forces shaping this era, economic concentration, militarized policy, racial inequality, and contested democracy, were not new. They were the latest expressions of enduring patterns. As this documentary moves toward its final sections, the focus shifts from events to meaning. What does this long history tell us about the nature of American power? About the limits of reform? About the role of ordinary people in shaping change? In the next part, we will step back from chronology and examine these questions directly, drawing together centuries of struggle, adaptation, and resistance to understand what American history reveals about democracy itself. When the full sweep of American history is examined through the lens Howard Zinn insists upon, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The most decisive forces shaping the nation have rarely been elections, speeches, or individual leaders alone. They have been conflicts over power, who holds it, who benefits from it, and who is excluded from it. Again and again, moments celebrated as national progress emerge not from generosity at the top, but from pressure below, from people who refuse to accept the limits placed upon them. This perspective reframes the meaning of democracy itself. Democracy, in practice, has never been a stable condition in the United States. It has been a contested process, expanding and contracting depending on social pressure and political fear. Voting rights were extended not because leaders suddenly embraced equality, but because denial became too costly to sustain. Labor protections emerged not from corporate goodwill, but from strikes that disrupted production and threatened order. Civil rights laws passed not simply because they were morally compelling, but because mass resistance made segregation untenable on the world stage. Zinn's insistence on this point challenges the comforting idea that the system naturally corrects itself. Reform, in his telling, is reactive rather than proactive. It occurs when unrest reaches a level that threatens stability, and it is often calibrated to restore confidence without altering fundamental power relations. This does not render reform meaningless, but it does place it in context. Gains are real yet fragile. Without continued pressure, they stall or erode. This dynamic explains why inequality persists despite centuries of struggle. Each expansion of rights has been met with new forms of exclusion. When slavery ended, segregation followed. When segregation fell, economic and carceral control expanded. When overt discrimination became unacceptable, structural inequality took its place. The language of equality evolved faster than the distribution of power. American history, seen this way, is less a steady march forward than a series of negotiations between resistance and authority. Elites adapt when forced. Institutions absorb change selectively. Narratives shift to accommodate new realities while preserving legitimacy. Zinn argues that this adaptability is both the strength and the danger of American democracy. It allows survival, but it also allows injustice to persist under new names. This framework also complicates how patriotism is understood. Loyalty to ideals has often required dissent against practice. Many of the figures now celebrated as national heroes were once viewed as threats. Abolitionists were accused of endangering the Union. Labor organizers were branded radicals. Civil rights activists were surveilled and attacked. Anti-war protesters were labeled traitors. In each case, opposition was framed as disloyalty until history reframed it as progress. Zinn does not romanticize resistance. He acknowledges fragmentation, failure, and internal conflict within movements. Change is rarely clean or unified, yet he insists that without resistance, injustice becomes normalized. Silence, not conflict, is the true enemy of democracy. This emphasis on agency is central to Zinn's work. History is not something that happens to people. It is something people participate in, whether consciously or not. Ordinary individuals shape outcomes through action, inaction, cooperation, and refusal. Even when movements fail to achieve immediate goals, they alter the boundaries of what is possible. They introduce new language, new demands, new expectations. The danger Zinn identifies in modern society is not apathy alone, but managed participation. Citizens are encouraged to vote, express opinions, and engage symbolically, while the structures that determine economic and military policy remain insulated from popular influence. Democracy becomes procedural rather than substantive. The appearance of choice masks the concentration of decision-making power. This insight resonates strongly in the present era, where information is abundant but influence feels distant. People know more than ever, yet often feel less capable of affecting change. Zinn cautions that awareness without organization risks becoming passive consumption rather than collective action. Knowledge, in his view, must be paired with solidarity to become transformative. American history also reveals how fear shapes policy. Fear of rebellion, fear of economic instability, fear of external enemies. These anxieties repeatedly justify expansions of authority. From colonial crackdowns to wartime repression to modern surveillance, fear narrows acceptable dissent. Zinn urges skepticism toward narratives that demand unity at the expense of questioning, noting how often such moments lead to lasting restrictions on freedom. Yet history also shows that fear can mobilize resistance as well. Economic collapse, war, and injustice have pushed people to organize, demand accountability, and imagine alternatives. A crisis exposes contradictions that stability conceals. This is why periods of upheaval, though painful, often produce the most significant shifts. The United States, in Zinn's telling, is neither uniquely virtuous nor uniquely corrupt. It is a society shaped by forces common to all complex systems. Competition for resources, struggles over legitimacy, and conflicts between ideals and interests. What makes American history distinctive is not the absence of oppression, but the persistence of resistance. Voices that were marginalized, silenced, or ignored continue to re-emerge, forcing the nation to confront itself. As this documentary moves toward its final sections, the focus turns fully to interpretation. What does this history demand of those who inherit it? Not guilt, Zinn argues, but responsibility. The past does not determine the future, but it reveals the mechanisms that shape it. Understanding those mechanisms is the first step toward meaningful participation. The central question Zinn leaves us with is not whether America has lived up to its ideals, but whether those ideals are treated as slogans or commitments. History suggests that ideals alone do nothing. They acquire power only when people insist they apply universally, even when doing so disrupts comfort and stability. In the next part, we will bring this long narrative into sharper focus, examining what a people-centered view of history ultimately asks of the listener, and how understanding the past differently can change the way the present is confronted. To truly understand American history from a people-centered perspective, it is necessary to step away from the illusion that history moves forward in clean stages. The past does not end neatly when a new era begins. Instead, unresolved struggles carry forward, reshaped by new language, new technology, and new conditions. Howard Zinn's work insists that what changes most across time is not the structure of power, but the way power explains itself. One of the most persistent myths in American culture is the idea that injustice is an exception rather than a feature. When inequality becomes visible, it is framed as a failure of individuals, institutions, or leaders, not as a predictable outcome of economic and political systems. This framing is powerful because it isolates problems, preventing them from being seen as connected. Zinn repeatedly challenges this fragmentation, showing how race, class, war, and labor are not separate stories, but threads of the same fabric. Consider how economic inequality has been explained across centuries. In the early republic, poverty was attributed to moral weakness. In the industrial age, it was blamed on immigrants or lack of discipline. In the modern era, it is framed as a failure to adapt, learn, or compete. The explanation changes, but the result does not. Wealth remains concentrated while insecurity spreads. Zinn argues that this continuity is not accidental. It is protected by narratives that normalize hierarchy while celebrating opportunity. Education plays a central role in maintaining these narratives. A traditional history education often focuses on leaders, wars, and laws, presenting change as something granted from above. By contrast, resistance is treated as disruption, extremism, or chaos. Zinn's approach reverses this lens. He places resistance at the center, not as a threat to democracy but as its engine. Without resistance, there is no reason for power to adjust. This shift in perspective is unsettling because it removes comfort. If progress comes from struggle rather than benevolence, then responsibility cannot be outsourced to institutions. Democracy becomes something people must actively sustain, not passively inherit. Zinn does not argue that resistance always succeeds, but that without it, injustice hardens into permanence. Another theme that deepens across American history is the relationship between economic power and political power. While democratic structures expand, economic decision-making becomes increasingly insulated. Corporations gain legal rights while individuals lose leverage. Campaign finance, lobbying, and regulatory capture blur the line between public service and private interest. Zinn views this not as corruption of an otherwise pure system, but as an expected outcome of capitalism operating within a political framework designed to protect property. This perspective helps explain why moments of crisis so often produce limited reform rather than transformation. When instability threatens profit or legitimacy, concessions are made. When pressure fades, progress stalls. This pattern appears in labor law, civil rights enforcement, environmental regulation, and social welfare. Reform becomes cyclical, advancing and retreating depending on public pressure. War has consistently played a role in managing this cycle. External conflict redirects attention, mobilizes nationalism, and justifies concentration of authority. Zinn traces this pattern from early frontier wars to modern global interventions. War creates unity through fear while suppressing dissent. It also creates economic opportunity for those positioned to benefit from military spending and reconstruction. Yet war also produces resistance. Veterans return with questions, communities absorb loss, moral clarity erodes as consequences become visible. Over time, the narrative fractures. Zinn argues that this delayed reckoning is not a failure of awareness, but a function of power. When decision-making is distant, accountability is delayed. Race remains one of the most enduring fault lines through which power is managed. Zinn does not present racism as a moral defect alone, but as a political strategy repeatedly used to divide potential alliances. When working-class solidarity threatens hierarchy, racial division is reinforced. This pattern appears in slavery, Jim Crow, labor organizing, housing policy, and criminal justice. Racism adapts as conditions change, becoming less explicit but no less effective. Gender follows a similar trajectory. Women's labor has always been essential, yet consistently undervalued. Rights expand slowly, often during moments of crisis, then are constrained once stability returns. Zinn highlights how women's movements repeatedly challenge not only legal exclusion, but cultural assumptions about authority, productivity, and worth. One of the most important contributions of Zinn's work is his refusal to treat marginalized groups as passive victims. Indigenous resistance, enslaved rebellion, worker organizing, feminist activism, and anti-war protest are not footnotes. They are central drivers of change. Even when they fail, they leave behind language, networks, and examples that later movements build upon. This continuity of resistance suggests that American history is not defined by who wins in the moment, but by what struggles refuse to disappear. Every generation inherits unfinished work. The presence of inequality does not indicate failure alone, it indicates ongoing contestation. As we move forward in this documentary, the focus will widen further. The remaining sections will explore how memory, media, and myth shape historical understanding, how modern movements fit into long patterns of resistance, and how a people-centered view of history changes not just what we know, but how we interpret the present. From here, the script will continue through expanded analysis of modern capitalism and democracy, media, propaganda, and historical memory, grassroots movements in the late 20th and early 21st century. What a people's history ultimately asks of the listener, one of the most powerful forces shaping American history is not law, war, or economics alone, but memory. How the past is remembered, taught, and repeated. Howard Zinn argues that history is never neutral because it is always selected. What is included signals importance. What is excluded shapes belief. Over time, these choices harden into national myth, making certain outcomes feel inevitable and certain injustices feel invisible. In mainstream narratives, American history is often told as a story of steady improvement, interrupted occasionally by mistakes that are later corrected. This framing is comforting because it suggests that the system works on its own timetable, independent of pressure or conflict. Zinn challenges this idea directly. He insists that what we call progress is usually the result of sustained confrontation, and what we call mistakes are often deliberate policies whose consequences were fully understood at the time. The role of education is central to this process. When students learn about slavery without learning about resistance, or labor rights without learning about strikes, history becomes a story of benevolence rather than struggle. Authority appears generous. Institutions appear self-correcting. Zinn believed this version of history discourages participation because it teaches people to wait rather than act. If change comes from above, there is little reason to organize below. Media reinforces this pattern. News cycles prioritize immediacy over context, framing social unrest as disorder rather than response. Protest becomes spectacle. Violence is isolated from cause. This is not simply a failure of journalism, but a reflection of power. Narratives that challenge economic or political hierarchy are harder to sustain because they threaten the interests that fund and regulate platforms. Zinn does not argue for conspiracy so much as structure. Stories that align with power travel farther and last longer. This helps explain why inequality can persist even as awareness increases. Knowing more does not automatically produce change. Awareness must be paired with organization, and organization must overcome fragmentation. Modern society, for all its connectivity, often isolates individuals into personalized streams of information, weakening collective action. Zinn warned that fragmentation is one of the most effective tools of control, not because it suppresses dissent, but because it disperses it. American history repeatedly shows how movements succeed when they create shared identity across difference. The abolition movement linked moral argument with direct action. Labor movements built solidarity across language and ethnicity, even as elites worked to divide them. The civil rights movement succeeded when it connected legal strategy with mass participation. Each of these movements faced internal conflict, but they endured because they recognized common cause. When movements fail, it is often because pressure becomes isolated, reform without solidarity stalls, outrage without organization fades. Zinn does not romanticize unity, but he emphasizes its necessity. Power is rarely challenged by individuals alone. It is challenged by sustained collective action that disrupts normal operation. This insight reframes how we understand modern political frustration. Many people sense that systems do not respond proportionally to public will. Elections occur, debates rage, yet fundamental economic and military policies remain largely unchanged. Zinn would argue that this is not evidence of apathy but of managed participation. The system allows expression but limits transformation, yet history also shows that limits shift under pressure. What once seemed impossible becomes inevitable after resistance reframes it as necessary. The 8-hour workday, women's suffrage, civil rights legislation, and labor protections were all dismissed as unrealistic until they became unavoidable. The boundary between the possible and impossible is political, not natural. Another recurring theme in American history is how success generates amnesia. Once gains are achieved, the struggle that produced them fades from memory. Rights come to feel permanent rather than contingent. This amnesia weakens vigilance, allowing rollback under new justifications. Zinn warned that forgetting struggle makes societies vulnerable to losing what was won. This dynamic is visible in labor rights erosion, voting restrictions, and civil liberties contraction. Each rollback is framed as administrative necessity, fiscal responsibility, or security measure. Without historical memory, these changes appear technical rather than political. Zinn's work serves as a counterweight to this forgetting, reminding readers that rights exist because they were demanded. The relationship between fear and authority remains central. Throughout American history, fear has been used to justify expansion of power, fear of indigenous resistance, fear of enslaved revolt, fear of communism, fear of terrorism. Each time, extraordinary measures are presented as temporary. Each time, they linger. Zinn encourages skepticism toward moments when unity is demanded at the cost of scrutiny. At the same time, fear can also mobilize resistance. Economic collapse, war, and visible injustice have repeatedly pushed people into action. Crisis reveals what stability conceals. Zinn does not celebrate crisis, but he recognizes its role in exposing contradictions that polite discourse avoids. American history, viewed through this lens, becomes less about national character and more about structural tension. Ideals coexist with exploitation. Democracy coexists with exclusion. Freedom coexists with coercion. These contradictions are not aberrations. They are the terrain on which history unfolds. As this documentary continues, the next sections will move further into reflection. We will examine how modern movements inherit historical strategies, how power adapts to resistance, and how a people-centered understanding of history reshapes the listener's relationship to the present. The goal is not to replace one myth with another, but to equip the audience with tools for interpretation. History in this view is not a finished story. It is a resource. It offers patterns, warnings, and possibilities. Understanding it differently does not guarantee change, but it expands what can be imagined. In the next part, we will explore how movements at the margins continue to shape American life in subtle but significant ways. and how the future of democracy depends less on when history is examined from the ground up rather than the top down. The future stops looking predetermined. One of the most powerful consequences of a people-centered view of American history is that it removes inevitability. Events that once seemed unavoidable, slavery, segregation, corporate dominance, endless war, are revealed instead as choices, sustained by policy, protected by narrative, and resisted at every stage. This realization shifts responsibility from abstract forces to human decision-making. Zinn's approach insists that power is not maintained by force alone, but by consent shaped through culture. Stories about hard work, merit, patriotism, and opportunity do not merely describe society, they organize it. When people believe that outcomes reflect personal virtue rather than structural advantage, inequality becomes easier to accept. When dissent is framed as threat rather than participation, authority feels natural rather than imposed. This helps explain why change is often slow even when injustice is widely acknowledged. Moral agreement does not automatically produce political momentum. Systems adapt to criticism by incorporating its language while resisting its demands. Inclusion becomes symbolic. Representation increases without redistribution. Diversity expands without equity. Zinn warns that this pattern can create the illusion of progress while leaving material conditions unchanged. American history shows that moments of symbolic victory are often followed by periods of consolidation. After emancipation came Jim Crow. After civil rights legislation came mass incarceration. After labor victories came deregulation and outsourcing. Each cycle reflects a familiar rhythm: concession under pressure, followed by retrenchment once pressure eases. This does not negate the importance of victories, but it underscores their fragility. Understanding this rhythm reframes the meaning of setbacks. Reversal does not necessarily indicate failure. It reveals resistance from entrenched power. Zinn encourages readers to measure movements not only by immediate outcomes, but by their capacity to shift language, expectations, and collective memory. Even defeated movements leave behind frameworks that later struggles inherit. This continuity is especially visible in grassroots organizing. Community networks, mutual aid, labor unions, and advocacy groups persist even when national attention moves elsewhere. Their work rarely makes headlines, yet it sustains resistance between moments of mass mobilization. Zinn emphasizes that history is not driven only by dramatic events, but by sustained effort that builds capacity over time. Modern technology complicates this process. Digital platforms allow rapid mobilization, but they also encourage short attention cycles. Outrage spreads quickly, then dissipates. Organization becomes harder to sustain when movements are driven by visibility rather than structure. Zinn would likely caution that tools do not replace relationships. Collective power requires trust built through shared risk and commitment. American history offers repeated examples of how durable movements form. They create spaces for education, shared identity, and collective decision-making. They accept internal disagreement while maintaining focus on common goals. They recognize that power will attempt to divide them along lines of race, gender, ideology, and generation. Successful movements anticipate this division and address it openly. Another lesson that emerges across centuries is the importance of local action. While national policy shapes conditions, many of the most meaningful changes begin at the local level. Desegregation efforts, labor organizing, environmental protections, and voting rights campaigns often start in specific communities before spreading outward. Zinn highlights how local victories build confidence and demonstrate possibility, even when national institutions resist. This local focus challenges the belief that meaningful change must come from national leadership. American history suggests the opposite. Leaders often follow rather than lead, responding to pressure once it becomes unavoidable. This does not diminish the importance of policy, but it clarifies where momentum originates. Zinn's work also asks difficult questions about responsibility. If history is shaped by ordinary people as much as by elites, then disengagement becomes a choice rather than an inevitability. This idea can feel burdensome. It removes the comfort of blaming institutions alone, yet it also restores agency. If systems are maintained through participation, they can be altered through withdrawal, disruption, and reorganization. This does not mean all responsibility is equal. Power remains unevenly distributed. Risk is not shared equally. Zinn never suggests that individuals alone can dismantle entrenched systems. He emphasizes collective action precisely because individual effort is insufficient. Agency exists, but it must be exercised together. American history also demonstrates that solidarity is hardest precisely when it is most necessary. Economic pressure, fear, and uncertainty make division easier. Scapegoating becomes tempting. Elites exploit this by redirecting frustration toward vulnerable groups rather than structural causes. Zinn's analysis repeatedly returns to this dynamic, showing how racial, ethnic, and cultural division has been used to prevent unified resistance. Yet solidarity has emerged repeatedly despite these pressures. Enslaved people forged community under surveillance. Workers organized across language barriers. Civil rights activists built coalitions under threat of violence. These moments do not erase division, but they prove it is not inevitable. Another recurring theme is the role of imagination. Before change becomes policy, it must become thinkable. Movements expand imagination by articulating alternatives, even when those alternatives seem unrealistic. Zinn treats imagination as a political force, not a luxury. The boundaries of possibility shift when people insist on naming what is absent. This is why history matters beyond education. It shapes imagination. When the past is presented as a series of closed outcomes, the future feels fixed. When the past is revealed as contested, the future opens. Zinn's insistence on telling history from below is not merely corrective, it is generative. It produces new ways of seeing what might be possible. As this documentary continues toward its final sections, the focus will turn increasingly toward synthesis. The remaining parts will draw together patterns across centuries, exploring what a people-centered history ultimately asks of those who hear it. Not agreement, not guilt, but engagement. History in this view is not something to admire or condemn from a distance. It is something to enter. It invites participation not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the alternative is resignation. In the next part, we will move closer to that conclusion, examining how the long arc of American history reshapes our understanding of responsibility, citizenship, and what it means to live within a democracy that has always been unfinished. Consensus, then on the willingness to confront conflict honestly. One of the most difficult ideas to accept in a people-centered view of American history is that democracy has never been something fully achieved. It has always existed in tension, shaped by struggle rather than stability. This challenges the comforting belief that democratic institutions alone guarantee justice. Zinn's work insists that institutions reflect the balance of power within society, not abstract ideals. When power shifts, institutions change. When power concentrates, institutions harden. This understanding forces a reevaluation of citizenship itself. Citizenship is often presented as a legal status conferred by birth or paperwork. But history shows that meaningful citizenship has always been contested. Enslaved people were denied it entirely. Indigenous people were excluded even as their land was claimed. Women possessed it in name but not in practice. Workers had it but lacked economic power to exercise it freely. Citizenship in this sense is not a fixed condition. It is something demanded, expanded, and defended. Throughout American history, moments of expanded citizenship have followed disruption. The end of slavery followed war and mass resistance. Women's suffrage followed decades of organizing and public defiance. Civil rights legislation followed protests that destabilized normal life. These expansions were not gifts. They were responses to pressure that could no longer be ignored. Zinn emphasizes that rights are rarely secured permanently. They must be renewed through vigilance. This insight reframes political participation. Voting matters, but it has never been sufficient on its own. Many of the most significant changes in American history occurred when people acted outside formal channels, through strikes, boycotts, marches, refusal, and mutual aid. These actions forced institutions to respond. Without them, elections alone often preserved existing hierarchies. Zinn's work also challenges the assumption that moderation is always virtuous. While compromise is often necessary, history shows that moderation frequently serves those already in power. Calls for patience and gradualism are usually directed downward, not upward. Those benefiting from the status quo rarely feel urgency. Those harmed by it do. Zinn does not reject compromise, but he insists on recognizing who sets its terms and who bears its costs. Another recurring theme is how democracy is constrained by economic structure. Political equality means little when economic power is vastly unequal. The ability to influence policy, shape narrative, and absorb risk correlates strongly with wealth. Zinn argues that this imbalance is not incidental. It is foundational. The American political system was designed to protect property as much as participation. Over time, that protection has expanded as wealth has concentrated. This reality complicates common debates about corruption. Corruption is often framed as deviation from normal operation. Zinn suggests it is more accurate to see it as alignment between political and economic interests. When policy consistently favors those with resources, the issue is not moral failure but structural design. Changing outcomes therefore requires more than ethical leadership. It requires altering incentives and power relationships. American history also reveals how dissent is managed rather than eliminated. When protest grows, it is often absorbed through language and symbolism. Radical demands are softened. Movements are celebrated in retrospect while their critiques are neutralized. This process preserves legitimacy while limiting transformation. Zinn warns that honoring past movements without continuing their work turns memory into containment. This pattern is visible in how figures like Martin Luther King Jr. are remembered. His radical critiques of economic inequality and militarism are often minimized in favor of sanitized messages about unity. Zinn argues that selective memory depoliticizes resistance, making it safe rather than challenging. Remembering fully is itself an act of resistance. The question of violence also appears repeatedly in American history. State violence is normalized through law and rhetoric. Resistance violence is condemned as disorder. Zinn does not romanticize violence, but he urges honesty about its asymmetry. The state possesses overwhelming force and uses it regularly, even when invisible. Judging resistance without acknowledging this imbalance distorts reality. Another uncomfortable lesson concerns responsibility across generations. Zinn rejects the idea of inherited guilt, but he emphasizes inherited conditions. People do not choose the systems they are born into, but they do choose how to relate to them. History shapes options, not obligations. Understanding the past does not demand self-blame, it demands awareness. This awareness is especially important in moments of relative comfort. Periods of stability often reduce urgency for change. Yet history shows that stability for some often rests on insecurity for others. Zinn cautions against measuring success solely by personal outcome. Collective conditions matter. Democracy weakens when people retreat into private success and abandon public responsibility. At the same time, Zinn avoids despair. His work is often mischaracterized as pessimistic, but it is deeply grounded in belief in human agency. The persistence of resistance across centuries suggests that people repeatedly refuse to accept imposed limits. Even when movements fail, they alter consciousness. They leave traces that re-emerge later. This persistence is not heroic in the abstract, it is practical. People organize because conditions demand it. They resist because survival requires it. Zinn's history is not about noble sacrifice alone, it is about necessity. Change happens because living within injustice becomes untenable. As this documentary approaches its final sections, the focus tightens further. The remaining parts will draw together these themes into a concluding reflection on what a people-centered history ultimately offers. Not answers, not certainty, but a framework for engagement. History in this view is not a monument to admire. It is a map of struggle. It shows where power resists, where it yields, and where it adapts. It does not tell us what will happen. It shows us what has happened when people chose to act or chose not to. In the next part, we will move closer to that final synthesis, examining how the long story of American resistance reshapes ideas of hope, responsibility, and the unfinished nature of democracy itself. One of the most revealing insights that emerges from examining American history through a people-centered lens is how often hope is misunderstood. Hope is frequently framed as optimism, the belief that things will naturally improve over time. But history offers little evidence for passive hope. Conditions do not drift toward justice on their own. What history shows instead is a different form of hope, one rooted not in expectation, but in action taken despite uncertainty. Throughout American history, people have organized without guarantees. Enslaved people resisted knowing punishment was likely. Workers struck knowing they might be fired, beaten, or killed. Civil rights activists marched knowing laws would not change quickly, if at all. Anti-war protesters spoke out knowing they might be ignored or condemned. These actions were not driven by confidence in success, but by refusal to accept conditions as permanent. Zinn's work insists that this distinction matters. Hope in this sense is not a feeling, it is a practice. It is the decision to act even when outcomes are unclear. This kind of hope does not depend on leaders, elections, or promises. It depends on people recognizing their shared conditions and choosing solidarity over resignation. American history repeatedly demonstrates how quickly hope fades when it is outsourced. When people place faith entirely in institutions, progress stalls. When reform becomes something expected rather than demanded, momentum dissipates. Zinn does not argue that institutions are irrelevant, but that they respond to pressure more reliably than to trust. Hope that waits is hope that weakens. This helps explain why moments of intense activism are often followed by disappointment. Expectations rise faster than systems can change. When outcomes fall short, cynicism sets in. Zinn cautions that this cycle is not accidental. Disappointment is politically useful. It discourages future participation by framing struggle as futile rather than incomplete. Yet history shows that struggle rarely ends when it appears to fail. It pauses, fragments, and reappears in new forms. Movements lose visibility, but ideas persist. Networks survive underground. Language spreads quietly. What looks like defeat often becomes groundwork. This continuity challenges the way success is measured. American culture tends to reward visible outcomes, legislation passed, elections won, policies enacted. But many of the most consequential changes in American history unfolded gradually, without immediate recognition. Attitudes shifted before laws. Norms eroded before institutions followed. Zinn emphasizes that these invisible changes matter because they expand what later becomes possible. Another lesson history offers is that moral clarity alone is insufficient. Many injustices persisted long after they were widely recognized as wrong. Slavery was morally condemned long before it ended. Segregation was questioned long before it fell. War has been criticized repeatedly without preventing future conflict. What changes outcomes is not awareness alone, but organization capable of applying sustained pressure. This is where collective memory becomes crucial. When past struggles are remembered as inevitable victories, present struggles feel unnecessary. When they are remembered as contested and uncertain, present action feels meaningful. Zinn's insistence on telling history from below is not simply about representation. It is about preserving memory of how change actually happens. The danger of forgetting this process is complacency. When people believe that rights are permanent, they are unprepared for erosion. When they believe democracy is self-sustaining, they are surprised when it weakens. History shows that regression rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives gradually, framed as necessity, efficiency, or security. American history offers countless examples of this gradual narrowing. Voting rights restricted through administrative barriers. Labor protections weakened through legal reinterpretation. Civil liberties constrained through emergency measures that never fully expire. Each change appears technical. Together, they reshape power. Zinn's work urges vigilance not as paranoia but as participation. Democracy is not something maintained through belief. It is maintained through engagement. The absence of resistance is not neutrality. It is consent shaped by fatigue, distraction, or fear. Another recurring theme is how power adapts to criticism. When exploitation is exposed, its language changes. When domination becomes visible, it becomes abstract. Control moves from physical force to bureaucratic process, from overt exclusion to statistical management. This evolution does not reduce harm, it obscures it. Understanding this helps explain why modern injustice often feels harder to confront. Systems are complex, responsibility diffuse, harm indirect. Zinn would argue that complexity itself becomes a shield. When no single villain can be identified, accountability weakens. Resistance must therefore become more informed, not less. Education in this context is not neutral. What people learn shapes what they believe is possible. When history is taught as finished, democracy feels complete. When it is taught as ongoing, democracy feels demanding. Zinn's work belongs firmly in the second tradition. This demand can feel exhausting. Participation requires time, energy, and risk. History does not promise fairness in reward. Many who struggled saw little benefit in their lifetime. Zinn does not hide this reality. Instead, he reframes success. Impact is not measured solely by personal outcome, but by contribution to collective momentum. American history, seen this way, is not a story of inevitable progress or inevitable decline. It is a record of choices made under pressure. Some expanded freedom, others restricted it. None were final. As we move closer to the final parts of this documentary, the narrative will begin to draw these insights together more explicitly. The remaining sections will focus on synthesis rather than expansion, asking what this history ultimately offers to those living now, not as instruction, but as orientation. We will explore how a people-centered understanding of history reshapes ideas of patriotism, responsibility, and civic life. We will examine what it means to inherit a democracy that has never been finished, and what history suggests about the cost of disengagement versus the cost of participation. The story is not ending. It is narrowing toward its essential question. As the long arc of American history comes into focus, one reality becomes increasingly clear. Democracy has never been a destination reached and secured, but a condition constantly negotiated. It exists not as a stable structure, but as a balance of forces that shifts depending on who participates, who withdraws, and who benefits from silence. Zinn's people-centered approach makes this instability visible, not as a flaw unique to America, but as a defining feature of all complex societies that claim to govern themselves. This understanding changes how patriotism itself can be understood. Patriotism is often framed as loyalty to symbols, institutions, or narratives that emphasize unity over conflict. Yet American history suggests that meaningful loyalty has often taken the form of dissent. Those who challenged slavery, segregation, labor exploitation, and war were frequently labeled unpatriotic in their own time. Only later were they celebrated, once their challenges no longer threatened existing power. Zinn insists that this pattern should make us cautious about equating obedience with commitment. A democracy that cannot tolerate internal challenge becomes fragile, regardless of how loudly it proclaims freedom. The tension between order and justice runs through every era of American history. Order is often treated as neutral, something everyone benefits from equally. But Zinn's work shows that order is always structured, and its stability often depends on whose suffering is made invisible. When people disrupt order through protest, strike, or refusal, they are rarely responding to chaos. They are responding to conditions that order has failed to address. History reveals that disruption is not the opposite of democracy, but one of its mechanisms. This perspective also reframes how violence is understood. State violence is normalized through law, bureaucracy, and distance. It becomes policy rather than action. Resistance violence, by contrast, is personalized and condemned. Zinn does not glorify violence, but he challenges the moral imbalance that condemns those who resist while excusing the structures that produce harm daily. Understanding this imbalance is essential to interpreting historical judgment, which often favors winners not because they were just, but because they prevailed. Another recurring theme in American history is how success reshapes struggle. When movements achieve partial victories, internal divisions often follow. Goals expand, priorities diverge, and unity frays. This fragmentation is frequently exploited by those in power, who frame disagreement as failure rather than evolution. Zinn suggests that disagreement is not weakness, but evidence of seriousness. Movements that stop arguing have usually stopped growing. History also shows that periods of apparent quiet are often misread as consensus. In reality, they are frequently periods when dissent has been suppressed, co-opted, or exhausted. Silence does not indicate satisfaction. It often signals fatigue. Zinn's work encourages skepticism toward claims that the absence of protest means the absence of injustice. The modern era complicates these dynamics further. Technology accelerates communication but also accelerates distraction. Outrage cycles move quickly, often without sustained follow-through. This creates the illusion of constant engagement while weakening long-term organization. Zinn's emphasis on solidarity and persistence becomes especially relevant here. Change has always required endurance, not just visibility. One of the most important lessons drawn from American history is that power rarely retreats voluntarily. Concessions are made when resistance threatens stability, legitimacy, or profit. This does not make power uniquely evil. It makes it predictable. Expecting generosity misunderstands incentives. Expecting response to pressure aligns with historical evidence. This understanding shifts how responsibility is assigned. Rather than asking whether leaders are good or bad, history invites questions about conditions. What pressures exist? What risks are tolerable? What alternatives are organized? Zinn's work suggests that leadership matters, but followership matters more. Leaders respond to movements they cannot ignore. American history also illustrates how easily moral language can be detached from material reality. Freedom, opportunity, and equality are invoked even when access to them is unequal. Zinn does not reject these ideals. He challenges their selective application. Ideals become meaningful only when enforced universally. Otherwise, they function as cover. This critique does not lead to nihilism. On the contrary, it restores meaning to action. If ideals are not self-executing, then insisting upon them becomes a political act. Democracy in this view is not something inherited, but something practiced. The persistence of resistance across centuries offers a counterweight to despair. Despite overwhelming odds, people have continued to organize, demand, and imagine alternatives. They have done so without guarantees, often without recognition. Their efforts form a continuous thread through American history, connecting seemingly isolated movements into a shared lineage of refusal. This lineage is not heroic in the abstract. It is ordinary. It consists of people responding to conditions that become intolerable. Zinn emphasizes that this ordinariness is its strength. It means participation is not reserved for exceptional individuals. It is available wherever people choose to act together. As this documentary approaches its final part, the focus becomes less about what has happened and more about what this history offers. Not instructions, not predictions, but orientation. A way of seeing that resists simplification and invites engagement. The last section will draw these insights into a final reflection on what a people-centered history ultimately demands of those who inherit it, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to participate in a story that has never been finished. One of the most enduring misconceptions about American history is the belief that power is primarily exercised through visible authority: presidents, courts, armies, and laws. While these forces matter, a people-centered reading reveals something subtler and often more consequential. Power is sustained through habits, through what becomes normal, through what people stop questioning. Zinn's work repeatedly draws attention to this quiet dimension of control, where injustice persists not because it is loudly enforced, but because it has been absorbed into everyday life. Over time, extraordinary conditions become ordinary, long work hours become expected, debt becomes normal, surveillance becomes invisible, war becomes distant, inequality becomes statistical rather than personal. When injustice is embedded into routine, it becomes harder to confront because it no longer feels like a crisis. It feels like reality. Zinn insists that history must disrupt this normalization by reminding us that what exists now was created through choice and can therefore be altered. This insight reframes how responsibility operates within large systems. Individuals often feel powerless because no single action appears capable of changing structural conditions. Zinn does not deny this limitation. Instead, he challenges the assumption that individual action must be sufficient on its own to matter. History suggests otherwise. Change rarely occurs through isolated heroism. It emerges through accumulation, many small actions that over time alter the balance of pressure. This accumulation is slow and often invisible while it is happening. Early labor organizers did not see immediate results. Civil rights activists endured years of defeat before any legislative victory. Anti-war resistance took decades to reshape public memory. Zinn emphasizes that patience in struggle is not passive. It is active endurance, sustained by collective commitment rather than expectation of quick success. Another recurring pattern in American history is how reform is framed as generosity rather than necessity. When concessions are made, they are often described as moral awakenings or enlightened leadership. This narrative obscures the conditions that made refusal impossible. Zinn's insistence on tracing reform back to resistance is not meant to diminish progress, but to preserve clarity about how it was achieved. Without this clarity, future struggles are weakened. The modern political landscape reflects this danger clearly. Many reforms are celebrated without acknowledgement of the movements that forced them. This creates the illusion that systems improve on their own, encouraging disengagement. Zinn argues that this is one of the most effective forms of depoliticization. When people believe progress is inevitable, they stop applying pressure. When pressure fades, gains erode. American history also reveals how easily reform can be reversed when vigilance declines. Voting rights expanded, then were narrowed through new barriers. Labor protections strengthened, then weakened through legal reinterpretation. Civil liberties widened, then contracted under emergency justification. Each reversal was framed as technical rather than political. Zinn warns that without historical memory, these shifts feel isolated rather than patterned. This pattern underscores the importance of continuity in resistance. Movements that dissolve entirely after achieving partial success leave no infrastructure to defend gains. Zinn emphasizes that organization matters as much as mobilization. Protests can spark attention, but institutions of resistance, unions, community groups, advocacy networks, sustain pressure over time. Another theme that deepens across American history is the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. American culture strongly emphasizes individualism, often framing success and failure as personal outcomes. Zinn challenges this framing by highlighting how collective conditions shape individual possibility. No one succeeds alone. No one fails alone. Systems distribute risk and reward unevenly regardless of effort. This insight complicates dominant narratives about merit. Hard work matters, but it does not operate in a vacuum. Access to education, healthcare, safety, and opportunity is structured. Zinn does not deny agency. He contextualizes it. Understanding this context does not excuse disengagement. It clarifies where effort must be applied collectively rather than individually. American history also demonstrates how fear distorts judgment. Fear of instability, fear of outsiders, fear of loss have repeatedly been used to justify expansion of authority. Zinn urges skepticism toward moments when fear is mobilized to silence debate. Emergency powers tend to persist long after emergencies end. History shows that freedoms surrendered temporarily are rarely fully restored. At the same time, fear can catalyze resistance when people recognize that silence carries its own risk. Economic collapse, War and visible injustice have pushed people into action when comfort no longer outweighs cost. Zinn's history suggests that the tipping point is not ideology but lived experience. People organize when conditions become personally intolerable. This does not make resistance inevitable. Many endure hardship without organizing, especially when divided. This is why division remains one of the most reliable tools of control. Race, ideology, religion, nationality, and culture have been used repeatedly to fragment potential solidarity. Zinn traces this strategy across centuries, showing how unity is discouraged precisely where it would be most powerful. Yet unity has emerged repeatedly despite these efforts. It has emerged imperfectly, temporarily, and often at great cost. These moments matter not because they solved everything, but because they expanded what people believed was possible. Zinn treats belief itself as a political force. When people believe change is possible, they act differently. When they believe it is impossible, systems harden. This brings the narrative back to history itself. History is not neutral information, it shapes belief. When history is told as a sequence of victories led by elites, people learn passivity. When it is told as a record of struggle led by ordinary people, participation feels relevant. Zinn's project was never simply about correcting facts. It was about changing orientation. As we continue into the remaining parts of this documentary, the focus will remain on this orientation. The next sections will examine how people-centered history reshapes ideas of progress, success, and responsibility in the present moment. We will explore how understanding patterns of resistance can inform modern movements without romanticizing the past or simplifying the future. This story is still unfolding. And history, as Zinn reminds us, does not belong to those who narrate it from above. It belongs to those who live within it and choose how to respond. As the people-centered view of American history continues to unfold, another pattern becomes unmistakable. The struggle over democracy has never been confined to laws or elections alone. It has always been a struggle over time, attention, and energy. Power does not only control resources, it shapes how much capacity people have to resist. When survival itself demands constant effort, participation becomes harder. Zinn's work repeatedly returns to this idea, showing how exhaustion functions as a political condition. Across centuries, those at the bottom of American society have faced a common constraint: lack of time. Enslaved people labored from dawn to exhaustion. Industrial workers worked long shifts with little rest. Sharecroppers were bound to cycles of debt that left no margin for organizing. Modern workers juggle multiple jobs, caregiving, and financial pressure. Zinn argues that democracy weakens not only when rights are denied, but when people are too depleted to exercise them. This insight reframes why participation often appears uneven. Disengagement is frequently moralized as apathy or ignorance, but history suggests it is more often the result of structural strain. When people lack security, organizing becomes risky. Speaking out threatens livelihood. Resistance carries cost. Zinn insists that judging participation without acknowledging this cost obscures reality. American history shows that moments of expanded participation often follow moments when collective support reduces individual risk. Mutual aid networks, labor unions, civil rights organizations, and community groups create shared protection. They distribute risk across many people, making action possible. This is why such organizations are frequently targeted by those in power. Undermining collective support isolates individuals, increasing the cost of resistance. This dynamic remains visible today. Legal barriers, financial precarity, and social fragmentation make sustained organizing difficult. Short bursts of outrage are easier to manage than long-term solidarity. Zinn would likely argue that modern power depends less on repression than on dispersion, keeping people busy, isolated, and uncertain. Another theme that deepens across American history is how narratives of inevitability discourage action. When economic systems are described as natural or technological outcomes rather than political choices, resistance appears futile. Zinn challenges this framing by documenting how every major economic arrangement in American history was constructed through policy, force, and negotiation. There was nothing inevitable about slavery, industrial exploitation, or financialization. Each was defended as necessary at the time. Understanding this history exposes the myth of inevitability as a political tool. When people are told that systems cannot change, responsibility shifts from decision-makers to fate. Zinn insists that naming choice where inevitability is claimed is itself an act of resistance. This perspective also reshapes how progress is evaluated. Modern discourse often measures progress through innovation, growth, or efficiency. Zinn asks a different question: who bears the cost of progress and who controls its direction? American history shows that technological and economic advancement often increase inequality unless actively constrained. Progress without redistribution consolidates power. This pattern appears repeatedly. Industrialization increased production but worsened working conditions until workers organized. Automation increased efficiency but reduced job security. Digital platforms increased connectivity while concentrating wealth and influence. Zinn's framework does not reject progress, it insists on accountability. Another recurring lesson concerns the fragility of rights during periods of fear. Crisis compresses decision-making. Urgency overrides deliberation. History shows that moments of crisis often produce lasting expansions of authority that outlive the crisis itself. Zinn's analysis of wartime repression, surveillance expansion, and emergency powers underscores how easily freedoms are framed as negotiable when stability feels threatened. Yet history also shows that crisis can produce clarity. When contradictions sharpen, neutrality becomes harder to maintain. Economic collapse, war, and visible injustice have repeatedly catalyzed organizing precisely because they disrupt routine. Zinn does not celebrate crisis, but he recognizes its role in exposing structural truths that comfort conceals. American history further reveals that moral consensus often follows material change rather than precedes it. Ideas that once seemed radical become acceptable after conditions shift. This does not mean ideas are irrelevant. It means they require context to gain traction. Zinn emphasizes that moral arguments become powerful when they align with lived experience. This alignment explains why movements often arise simultaneously across different regions and communities. Shared conditions produce shared response. The challenge becomes coordination. History shows that when movements connect across difference, they amplify impact. When they remain isolated, they are easier to contain. Division remains one of the most reliable defenses of power. American history documents how race, ideology, and identity have been used repeatedly to fracture potential coalitions. Zinn's work does not deny real differences. It highlights how those differences are manipulated to prevent shared action around common conditions. This manipulation is often subtle. It frames conflict as cultural rather than economic, individual rather than systemic. It encourages competition over scarcity rather than cooperation for redistribution. Zinn argues that recognizing these patterns is essential for modern resistance. Without that recognition, movements risk reproducing the very divisions that weaken them. Another theme that becomes clearer across history is the importance of patience paired with persistence. American culture often celebrates dramatic moments, marches, speeches, elections, while undervaluing sustained effort. Zinn insists that change depends on what happens after the moment passes. The work of maintaining pressure, building institutions, and adapting strategy is less visible but more decisive. This emphasis challenges the expectation of quick results. History suggests that meaningful change unfolds over generations, not news cycles. This does not excuse delay. It contextualizes struggle. Zinn encourages a long view, one that values contribution even when outcomes are uncertain. As we approach the final stages of this documentary, these insights begin to converge. The story is no longer about specific events, but about patterns that repeat under different conditions. Power adapts, resistance responds. Gains are made, then contested. Democracy expands, then contracts. None of these movements are final. The remaining parts will draw these patterns into sharper relief, examining how a people-centered understanding of history informs action in the present. We will explore how knowledge of past struggle can strengthen modern movements without idealizing them, and how recognizing continuity can sustain engagement even when change feels slow. The work of history, as Zinn reminds us, is not to reassure. It is to clarify. As the patterns of American history stretch across centuries, another truth becomes clear. Systems of power do not rely solely on domination, but on adaptation. When resistance emerges, power rarely responds with the same tactics twice. It learns. It absorbs language, reframes demands, and reshapes institutions just enough to survive. Zinn's people-centered history makes this adaptability visible, reminding us that victories are never final because power is never static. This adaptability explains why reform can feel both real and insufficient at the same time. The conditions improve, yet core dynamics persist. Wages rise, but inequality widens. Rights expand, but access remains uneven. Representation increases, but decision-making stays concentrated. Zinn does not dismiss reform as meaningless. He warns against mistaking reform for resolution. Reform alters the terrain of struggle. It does not end it. American history shows that every major reform produces new boundaries. Once one demand is met, the question becomes how far change is allowed to go. Power redraws limits, often using the language of reasonableness, practicality, or unity. Demands beyond those limits are labeled extreme. This process does not require repression alone. It relies on persuasion, convincing people that what exists now is enough. This persuasion is reinforced through culture. Media, education, and political discourse play a central role in shaping expectations. When people are told repeatedly that progress has already occurred, further demands appear ungrateful or destabilizing. Zinn emphasizes that this framing transforms history into a ceiling rather than a foundation. The past becomes something to protect rather than something to build upon. This dynamic is especially visible in how social movements are remembered. Once a movement achieves partial success, its radical edges are softened. Its most challenging ideas are removed. What remains is a narrative of unity and consensus that obscures conflict. Zinn argues that this selective memory serves power by honoring resistance only after it no longer threatens existing arrangements. Understanding this process changes how the present is interpreted. When new movements are criticized for being disruptive or unrealistic, history suggests this reaction is predictable. The same criticisms were leveled against nearly every movement now celebrated. What differs is not the tone of dissent, but the stage of struggle. Another recurring lesson from American history concerns scale. As systems grow larger and more complex, accountability diffuses. Responsibility is spread across institutions, committees, and processes until no single actor appears culpable. Zinn highlights how this diffusion protects power. When harm is systemic, blame becomes abstract. Resistance must therefore confront systems rather than individuals alone. This reality complicates modern activism. Targeting a single leader or policy often feels insufficient because underlying structures remain intact. Zinn's work suggests that effective resistance requires both immediate demands and long-term vision. It must address symptoms while challenging root causes, even when doing so seems overwhelming. American history also reveals how power manages dissent by fragmenting issues. Economic injustice is separated from racial injustice. Environmental harm is separated from labor exploitation. War is separated from domestic policy. This fragmentation prevents coalitions from forming around shared conditions. Zinn insists that reconnecting these issues is essential because they are produced by overlapping systems. When movements recognize these connections, they become more difficult to contain. Solidarity across difference threatens power precisely because it reduces division. This is why such solidarity is consistently discouraged. History shows that unity is not suppressed only through force, but through narrative, by framing struggles as competing rather than interconnected. Another insight that emerges from long-term historical analysis is the role of sacrifice. Change often requires people to risk comfort, reputation, or security. American culture tends to celebrate sacrifice rhetorically while discouraging it materially. Zinn does not glorify sacrifice for its own sake. He acknowledges its cost, but he also notes that meaningful change has rarely occurred without it. This recognition challenges consumer-based models of participation, where engagement is expected to be convenient and low risk. History suggests otherwise. Resistance disrupts routine, it creates tension, it demands endurance. Zinn argues that accepting this reality is not pessimism, it is honesty. American history also teaches that leadership is contextual rather than inherent. Leaders emerge because conditions demand articulation and coordination. They are shaped by movements as much as they shape them. When movements weaken, leaders lose influence. Zinn cautions against focusing too heavily on individual figures at the expense of collective capacity. This perspective reframes disappointment in leadership. Rather than asking why leaders fail to deliver, history invites questions about pressure, organization, and leverage. Leaders respond to constraints. Movements change those constraints. As the narrative continues toward its final parts, the emphasis shifts increasingly toward application. What does a people-centered history offer those living now? It does not provide formulas, it provides patterns. It does not guarantee outcomes, it clarifies conditions. The enduring lesson is not that progress is inevitable or impossible, but that it is contingent. It depends on who acts, how persistently, and with what understanding of power. History does not move in one direction, it responds to force. This realization can be unsettling. It removes the comfort of certainty, but it also restores agency. If outcomes are not predetermined, participation matters. If systems adapt, resistance must adapt as well. If history is unfinished, then engagement is not symbolic. It is consequential. The remaining sections will bring these ideas closer to the present, examining how people-centered history reshapes the way we understand responsibility, solidarity, and the long work of democracy. We are not approaching an ending, but a sharpening of focus, one that recognizes the weight of the past without surrendering to it. History, after all, does not demand belief, it demands attention. When the full sweep of American history is viewed through this people-centered lens, one of the most difficult but essential realizations emerges. The greatest threat to democracy is not collapse, but normalization. Systems rarely fail all at once. They erode gradually, adjusting expectations until diminished participation feels ordinary and diminished accountability feels unavoidable. Zinn's work draws attention to this slow transformation, warning that democracy is most vulnerable when injustice becomes familiar. Normalization operates quietly. Policies introduced as temporary become permanent. Inequality explained as transitional becomes structural. Exceptional measures justified by crisis become routine tools of governance. Over time, the extraordinary is absorbed into the everyday, and resistance becomes harder not because conditions improve, but because outrage dulls. Zinn insists that history must interrupt this dulling by restoring context, by reminding us that what feels normal now once felt unacceptable. This process of normalization also reshapes how responsibility is perceived. When injustice is framed as systemic and diffuse, individuals often feel absolved of agency. The problem appears too large, too complex, too entrenched to confront. Zinn does not deny the scale of modern systems. He challenges the conclusion that scale eliminates responsibility. History suggests the opposite. The larger and more abstract power becomes, the more essential collective action grows. American history repeatedly shows that moments of transformation occur when people stop waiting for permission. Rights have expanded when individuals and communities acted as though those rights already belonged to them, by voting when discouraged, organizing when prohibited, speaking when silenced. These acts were illegal, disruptive, and risky at the time. They became lawful only after they became unavoidable. Zinn emphasizes that legality follows legitimacy, not the reverse. This insight reframes obedience itself. Obedience is often presented as civic virtue, especially in times of uncertainty. Yet history reveals that obedience has just as often sustained injustice as order. Zinn does not argue for disorder for its own sake. He argues for discernment, recognizing when obedience serves justice and when it serves power. Another lesson that deepens across American history is the danger of isolating morality from material conditions. Moral condemnation without structural challenge produces frustration rather than change. Many injustices persist not because they are morally defended, but because they are economically and politically profitable. Zinn insists that confronting injustice requires confronting interests, not only attitudes. This is why symbolic change often outpaces material change. Language evolves faster than policy. Representation expands faster than redistribution. Zinn warns that symbolic victories, while meaningful, can create false closure if they are not followed by structural reform. The appearance of inclusion can mask continued exclusion beneath new terminology. American history also demonstrates how quickly gains can be reversed when power feels unthreatened. Without sustained pressure, reforms stagnate. Protections weaken, enforcement erodes. This pattern does not reflect conspiracy so much as incentive. Institutions respond to pressure, not gratitude. Zinn's emphasis on this reality is not cynical, it is practical. The persistence of inequality across generations underscores this point. Economic advantage compounds, disadvantage compounds faster. Without deliberate intervention, disparities widen. Zinn's work challenges the idea that markets alone can resolve this imbalance. History shows that markets reflect power relationships. When left unchecked, they magnify inequality rather than reduce it. This understanding complicates popular narratives about opportunity. Opportunity exists, but it is unevenly distributed and often contingent on conditions beyond individual control. Zinn does not deny personal effort. He contextualizes it. Effort operates within structures that can either amplify or constrain its effect. Ignoring this reality shifts responsibility downward while shielding decision-makers. Another theme that becomes unavoidable in a people-centered history is the role of imagination in sustaining democracy. Before change occurs materially, it must be imagined collectively. Movements expand imagination by articulating alternatives that challenge what feels fixed. Zinn treats imagination as a political resource, not an abstraction. When imagination narrows, democracy contracts. This contraction is often reinforced by narratives of inevitability and exhaustion. People are told that nothing fundamentally different is possible or that change would require unacceptable sacrifice. History suggests otherwise. Change has always required sacrifice, but so has stasis. The cost of maintaining unjust systems is often hidden, dispersed, and deferred. Zinn argues that making these costs visible is a critical function of historical understanding. American history also reveals how easily fear overrides solidarity. Economic uncertainty, cultural anxiety, and perceived threat have repeatedly been used to divide communities. Zinn traces how these divisions weaken resistance by redirecting frustration toward vulnerable groups rather than toward systems. Recognizing this pattern is essential for avoiding repetition. Yet history also shows that solidarity can reemerge even after deep division. Shared conditions eventually outweigh manufactured differences. This does not happen automatically. It requires deliberate effort, dialogue, and trust building. Zinn emphasizes that solidarity is not spontaneous. It is constructed through shared struggle. As the narrative moves toward its final section, one reality stands out with increasing clarity. Democracy is not maintained by belief in ideals alone. It is maintained by continuous engagement, skepticism toward power, and willingness to act collectively despite uncertainty. History offers no guarantees, but it offers evidence. Evidence that systems change when pressure accumulates. Evidence that resistance reshapes possibility. Evidence that silence serves power more reliably than dissent. The final part of this documentary will draw these insights together into a closing reflection, not to offer comfort, but to offer orientation. not to prescribe action but to clarify stakes. History does not tell us what to do. It tells us what has happened when people chose to act and when they chose not to. When American history is finally allowed to speak in full, without shortcuts, without hero worship, without comforting myths, it does not deliver a verdict. It delivers a responsibility. The past does not tell us what to believe, and it does not guarantee what will happen next. What it offers instead is something far more demanding: clarity, clarity about how power behaves, clarity about how change actually occurs, clarity about what is lost when people stop paying attention. This clarity can be uncomfortable because it strips away the illusion that democracy is self-sustaining. American history shows that democracy has never survived on ideals alone. It has survived only when people insisted, repeatedly, often at great cost, that those ideals be made real. When that insistence faded, democracy narrowed. When it returned, democracy expanded again, imperfectly, temporarily, but unmistakably. The most sobering lesson is not that injustice exists. It is that injustice persists most easily when it becomes ordinary. When inequality is framed as natural. When violence is framed as necessary. When silence is framed as stability. History shows that the greatest damage is rarely done by dramatic acts of cruelty alone, but by long periods of quiet acceptance. Yet history also offers something profoundly hopeful, though not in the way hope is usually presented. It does not promise that progress is inevitable. It does not promise that justice will arrive on its own timetable. What it shows instead is that progress has always depended on people who refused inevitability altogether. People who acted without permission. People who organized without guarantees. People who challenged systems far larger than themselves. They were rarely certain they would succeed. Many did not, but their actions altered the boundaries of what was possible. They changed language, they shifted expectations. They forced institutions to respond. And in doing so, they left traces that later generations could build upon. This is the continuity that runs through American history, often overlooked but never absent. A continuity of refusal. A continuity of participation. A continuity of people who understood, sometimes instinctively, that disengagement is not neutral. It always favors those already in power. The story of the United States is not a story of constant betrayal or constant triumph. It is a story of tension between ideals and interests, between freedom and control, between what is promised and what is practiced. That tension has never been resolved, and history offers no evidence that it ever will be. What history does show is that the balance shifts depending on who participates. Democracy weakens when people are taught that their role is finished. Democracy narrows when people are told that change is impossible. Democracy erodes when people are convinced that silence is maturity. But democracy expands when people remember that every right they possess exists because someone before them refused to accept exclusion as permanent. This is why how history is told matters. Not because the past needs defending or condemning, but because the present is shaped by what people believe is normal, inevitable, or finished. A people-centered history does not offer comfort. It offers orientation. It teaches how power adapts, how resistance responds, how gains are made, and how easily they are lost when vigilance fades. The question history leaves us with is not whether the United States has lived up to its ideals. It clearly has not. The more important question is whether those ideals are treated as decoration or as obligation. History suggests that ideals mean nothing unless people are willing to insist on them, repeatedly, collectively, and often inconveniently. There is no final chapter in this story, no moment where the struggle ends and democracy is complete. Every generation inherits unfinished work. Every generation decides, consciously or not, whether to continue it. The past does not demand guilt. It does not demand loyalty to myth. It demands awareness. Awareness that systems endure when people stop questioning them. Awareness that change occurs when pressure becomes unavoidable. Awareness that participation is not a guarantee of success, but absence guarantees stagnation. History does not ask us to be heroes, it asks us to be present, to recognize patterns, to understand that silence is not safety, and neutrality is not protection. It asks us to remember that the most important changes in American history did not begin in halls of power, but in ordinary lives pushed to extraordinary decisions. This documentary does not end with certainty, because certainty has never been the engine of progress. It ends with something more honest, the understanding that history is not behind us, it is beneath us, supporting what exists or reshaping what comes next. The story continues not because it must, but because people choose whether it does. And that choice, made quietly, collectively, and repeatedly, has always been the true force behind American history.